who's working our tech for this presentation. Just wants to introduce herself briefly, so you can contact her if you have any problems.
Hello, everyone. Oh, you can't see me. Oh, there we are. Hello. Sorry. Great start. My name is Holly Wanenberger. I am the assigned tech person. You will find my email address in the chat. So if you get kicked out of this call, if you have any other technical issues, feel free to just send me an email and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. And then just kind of a blanket reminder, if everyone could leave their cameras off while the panelists are speaking. This call is being recorded, so it just kind of helps the quality of the recording. And just leave yourself muted until you are speaking. So if you have a question towards the end, that's fine to unmute yourself, but just for the time being, keep yourself muted. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for your help in setting all this up, Holly. Basically what we're going to be doing today is I'm going to introduce all of the speakers of the panel, give them an opportunity to, describe who they are, why they're interested in, the topic of policing in our community, and, give them a chance to sort of, explain some of the issue as they see it. I'll certainly have a few questions for the panel, and then we'll open it up towards the end of the presentation for everyone in the audience to be able to ask questions to whomever they like. If, as the presentation is going on, you think of a question and you want to have it memorialized, just write it in the chat. And when we start the question and answer session, we'll look at the chat and ask those questions of the panel members as appropriate. So first off, my name is George Welch. I am a human rights attorney at the CHRO. So again, thank you all for coming to this panel and for being part of this conference today. We hope that we can have a open and honest and ideally productive conversation, and that we can, bring some takeaways from it into the work that you all are doing every day. So first, I'll let you know who we have on the panel, and then I'll turn it over to them to give a brief summary of themselves. We have Mr. Richard Glass here today. He's from the Office of the Chief Public Defender. We have Ken Barone. He's from the Connecticut Racial Profiling Prohibition Project. And I believe I saw, although I don't see his camera on yet, Michael Fumadi from the New Haven Police Department. There's another speaker we're waiting on, but it doesn't appear that he's logged in yet. So if he does log in, I will introduce him. So first I'll send it over to you, Rashad. I mean, obviously policing in our community is an incredible hot button issue right now. I mean, so many of the civil rights issues that we have going on are being funneled through the idea of policing in our community, and so much of the protesting and the community building and outreach that's going on is revolved around policing. Tell me a bit about the work you do, and what brings you here today to this conversation.
Thank you. As stated, my name is Rashad Glass. I'm an attorney with the Office of the Public Defender. Currently work out of the Hartford JD office. I've been working with the Office of the Public Defender since 2005. I also sit on the advisory board for the Racial Profiling Prohibition Project, along with Mr. Barone. And what drew me into criminal defense in the first place was some interactions I had with police. And unfortunately, it's a subject we have to talk about if we're going to address issues that really need to be addressed, and that's racism. I don't want to take up too much time, but I do have some thoughts on the issue. And if I could just take a few minutes. I'm
Absolutely,
try to share my, I'm not sure if my slide is showing.
I think it's coming up right now. I see the screen enlarging. There we go.
Okay. Unfortunately, I'm not sure what your screen is showing. It should be showing a woman wearing a necklace.
That's what we see. At least that's what I see.
Okay. So I want everyone to take a look at this photograph. And if you know the individual, you may be wondering where I'm going with this. If you don't know who that is, then you're probably still wondering where I'm going with this. But if you don't recognize her, you may recognize her from this other photo taken a lot earlier in her life. Yes, the woman in the first photo, as pictured here as a young girl, is the civil rights icon Ruby Bridges. And this current photo is the one that most people are probably more acquainted with. She's currently 67 years old. And if you're familiar with her story, as it came as a shock to me when I believe she was selected as a commencement speaker at a university or something, I was shocked at how young and vibrant she was. When I had the story in my head, it really drove home how recent the adversities that she had to go through just going to elementary school at 6 years old. So at age 6, Ruby Bridges became the first African-American student to integrate an elementary school in the South, Louisiana to be exact. And she had to overcome several barriers, as you would assume. The school district implemented entrance exams for African-American students first, which she fortunately passed. And then even once she passed those exams, she had to face resistance. Walking to school, she had to face racist crowds yelling slurs. She had to be escorted by federal marshals along with her mother to school on a daily basis. She had to eat lunch alone. There was only one teacher who would teach her. So she basically went through the school year in complete isolation aside from her single instructor. And a lot of the parents not wanting their children to interact with her actually just withdrew their children from the school district. Then, of course, her example, while she may have been the first in the South, her example wasn't the only example back then. You had, of course, later you had Vivian Malone and James Hood integrating University of Alabama in 1963. I'm sure many of you have seen the photos from there. And again, this is something as simple as just going to school. And what does this show? It shows a culture that unfortunately exists, and not just in America, but I'm talking specifically about America at this point. And again, it's not ancient history. Miss Bridges is only 67 years old at this point. And who are her peers currently? They're your lawyers, your doctors, law enforcement, teachers. They all grew up under this system. If you look at government, what's the average age of Congress right now? The U.S. Senate, it's about 64. House of Representatives a little younger at about 58. So these are her peers. They all grew up in this system. And these are people drafting legislation. This isn't something that they read about in a classroom. They were there. They lived it. And they were raised under these circumstances. And unfortunately, I'm sure some of them were even raised with the views of the parents who withdrew their children. Some of them may have even been withdrawn themselves. So I think it's a fatal flaw when you talk about policing to not pay attention to these issues that we face in this country. Because just as they show up in other areas of our lives, like education, housing, it certainly shows up in policing as well. Now, you may be saying, well, you bring up two examples from the South, University of Alabama, Louisiana. We're up north. you know, that stuff doesn't go on here. Martin Luther King spent a summer here. He spoke glowingly of Simsbury. And there's a whole other context with that I'll save for a later day. But how does that show up in policing? Well, you have Alvin Penn's situation, which was essentially what led to the birth of the racial profiling prohibition project. And if you look at the Trumbull police chief's response when dealing with that situation, when a memo that he had sent to his officers, which talked about how they should engage in policing. I believe it was specifically talking about, I believe they were dealing with robberies or something. The memo stated that one form of deterrence might be to develop a sense of proclivity toward the type of persons and vehicles which are usually involved in these crimes. And basically, we're provided with a profile of our community and those who travel within its borders. Now, is he going out there saying the N-word? Or no, he's not doing that. But if you're familiar with Lee Atwater and his Southern strategy for being able to win the hearts and votes of racists, you know, it promotes basically how you can do that without being so overt about it. And it's that kind of coded language, things of that nature, that unfortunately were prevalent in a lot of police departments. There's an individual quoted in the New York Times, Noel McGregor, back I believe it was the mid or late 90s, when he said he was a former Hartford police detective. And he stated that anyone who's been involved in law enforcement knows that this racial profiling happens, and to say it doesn't is ridiculous and disingenuous, and that whether it's for checking a license or issuing a summons or minor infraction, the overall goal is to keep people of color out of certain towns. In Avon, Connecticut, mid 90s, they had another issue with their first African American officer indicated that when he first joined, officers told him that racial profiling was a routine practice and that was still espoused by the supervisors. So his thought was that for any police official to deny that it existed is a joke. And so I'm saying all this to say that racism, unfortunately, is a part of our society. And just as with policing, and unfortunately, we see this in adverse and disparate treatment in the medical field as well. We certainly need to pay attention to these issues. It's not to say that progress hasn't been made. I believe that the project, the Racial Profiling Prohibition Project, has done some great work and is continuing to do work towards alleviating a lot of these problems. However, it's certainly not the time to spike the football. I believe the last few years has certainly shown us that. Because if things were okay, you wouldn't have two scenarios that happened in recent history. One, the individual here, Elijah McClain, on a call of just somebody looked a little off, no crime reported or anything, unarmed, ends up stopped, choked by police, injected with sedatives by paramedics, and dies. Again, no unarmed, no report of violence or even any crime. And that's unfortunately the result he gets. Then you have scenario two, where you have an underage individual carrying a weapon. And how is he treated by law enforcement when he encounters them? He's given water. He's told, thank you for being here. And then he goes on to shoot two people, then walks right by police officers again, leaves Wisconsin and goes to turn himself in Illinois. Now, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell you that it would have been different were he a different shade, but experience leads me to make a pretty pretty good guess as to how it would have turned out. And again, we see this throughout history. These are just a few examples, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you, Rashad, for setting the table for our conversation in such a comprehensive and compelling way. Thank you for that. I'll now turn to Ken Barone of the Connecticut Racial Profiling Prohibition Project. Ken, would you tell us a bit about yourself, the work that the project that you help lead is doing, and what brings you to this conversation today?
Great, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me. It's great to see so many familiar names on the screen. My name is Ken Barone. I'm with the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy, now at the University of Connecticut. And we have been managing the state of Connecticut's racial profiling initiative for over 10 years. And just for folks that may not be familiar, although I'm sure many are, what brought our institute to the work in particular was the federal investigation into the East Haven Police Department back in 2011. And so, if you will recall, the federal government investigated for civil rights violations the East Haven Police Department, and as a result of that, the state decided to rewrite their racial profiling law. And one of the things that they did was try to move the law into the 21st century. So prior to the law being rewritten in 2012, most police were still collecting data on paper forms, submitting it to a state agency that wasn't given the resources to do anything meaningful with that data. And so we had a law on the books that was effectively defunct. And so the success of our program has largely been the result of a few things. And the first is that a group of dedicated stakeholders from across the spectrum came together and formed an advisory board that the state ended up putting into statute. It's about a 20-member advisory board. They meet almost monthly, and they have met almost monthly for 10 years. They have a number of working groups and subcommittees that have changed over time based on the need and the evolution of the project. But, when we first started this work, we ourselves at the Institute were sort of new to this. And so we looked across the country and said, well, let's figure out what other states are doing. And we tried to model what we were doing based on what other states were doing. But the reality is that no state had actually figured out a really good way to, states had figured out a good way to collect data, right? You had some states that, had put good systems in place to capture data, but they didn't necessarily have good systems in place to do anything meaningful with that data. And what we were seeing happening across the country is most states that collected information on traffic stops did one of two things with the data. They either just put it out there and said to folks, you make of it what you will, or they would compare who was stopped to some census benchmark, right? 5% of the drivers stopped in town A were black, and only 2% of the population is black, as an example. That would be a comparison made. States primarily focused on collecting data around traffic stops because it is, to this day, the most common encounter that the public has with law enforcement. And so the idea was that if we can capture interactions that happen on a routine basis with law enforcement, that could give us a good window into whether or not disparities exist and what could be driving those disparities. So when we looked what was happening across the country, what we saw was every time researchers would come in and do one of these two reports, either just summarizing data or trying to compare it to some indicator, almost the same thing always happened. Advocates would come forward and say, look, there's clear disparities. Racism is clearly prevalent in law enforcement. And what are you going to do about it to resolve it? And on the other side, law enforcement would come to the table and they'd say, well, the analysis didn't do a good enough job accounting for the complexities of policing, right? We have crime that's up in this neighborhood and we're trying to deal with it in this way, and we have more accidents over here, and there's other socioeconomic factors that could be driving our presence in certain areas, and we have a mall, we have a community college, right? And rather than bringing two groups together to try and close the divide between law enforcement and the communities they served, research and data was actually being used to further divide them. And we were pretty conscious about not wanting to go down that rabbit hole, not wanting to create a system that further divided law enforcement and the communities they served, but to use data to try and identify and resolve any disparities that were found, and to try and increase or improve the trust and legitimacy in policing. And so one of the ways we do that in Connecticut is we don't simply, as a university or as researchers, put an annual report out that just points the finger at law enforcement and walk away. We have a fairly complex system, but we work to identify those departments with the most significant racial and ethnic disparities. And then we work with those agencies and we bring in the community to engage in additional research and conversations about what are the factors that could be driving those disparities. And then if we can identify ways to address those disparities, then we work with the department to have those interventions to do that. And I'll give you just two quick examples, and then I'll kind of try and wrap up my introductory comments about about how this work has evolved and how successful it has been. And what I have found most rewarding, right, is when that light bulb goes off and you go, wait a second, there is this, you're seeing that this program is having an actual impact on policing for the better. We had identified a police department a few years ago with significant racial disparities in stopping motorists. And when we went in to work with the department to understand what was driving those disparities, what we found was that this agency stopped more cars for low-level defective lighting violations than any other town in the state of Connecticut. And in fact, almost 30% of all of their traffic stops were for some sort of a defective light, a headlight out, a tail light out, a brake light out, a license plate light out. And that was the number one reason for stopping cars in this town. That's sort of unusual. Typically, speeding, cell phone violations tend to be the top two reasons for stopping cars in most towns. Defective lighting stops might make up anywhere between 8 and 10% of a department's total stop percentages. 30% was very high. And so when we engaged the department in a conversation about why this was the case, they told us, well, this is a result of our roving DUI patrol. We send our officers out during peak drinking hours. We have them stop cars for any low-level reason that they can think of so that they can interact with the driver. Where are you coming from? Where are you going to? Have you had a drink tonight? If they haven't and they don't appear intoxicated, hey, your headlights out, your taillights out, you should get that fixed. Have a nice day. We weren't seeing these individuals receive infractions as a result of these stops. They were largely resulting in verbal warnings. So it sort of fit with the narrative law enforcement laid out for us. And the question then was, how effective of a strategy is this? Are you getting drunk drivers off the street? Because we know that that type of enforcement was driving their racial and ethnic disparity, largely based on where they were doing the enforcement in and around the borders of the two cities that they bordered. And they said, oh, of course it's effective, right? Of course it's a good strategy for getting drunk drivers off the street. And we said, okay, how many drunk drivers did you get as a result of that? And the truth is they didn't know. So we went back and we looked. And out of 1,608 drivers stopped for low-level defective lighting violations, the department only identified one drunk driver. And in fact, out of the 740 speeders that they stopped, they found 23 drunk drivers. And where they found the most drunk drivers is when they stopped vehicles for crossing the double yellow line, right? It's a clear moving violation that is an indication of intoxication. They found the largest number of drunk drivers when they stopped cars for that particular violation. And so in this case, it was a matter of working with the agency to develop a strategy that allowed them to achieve the goal that they wanted to achieve, which was making the roadway safer by identifying and removing drunk drivers, but having a strategy that's applied in a fair and equitable manner. And the truth is that for most police agencies, they haven't looked at data in this way. There are some assumptions that certain strategies are more effective than they are. There's a lot of policing strategies around traffic enforcement in particular that are a result of the war on drugs that for a long time were used, and data is now telling us that they weren't necessarily the most effective strategies at achieving the goals law enforcement set out to achieve, and they largely harmed or impacted in a disproportionate way Black and brown communities. What we have consistently found in our research is that when police use the motor vehicle code to focus on hazardous driving behaviors, to focus on the violations that impact the safety of the roadway, we see little to no racial disparities in the data. It says the motor vehicle code starts to be used as part of, say, a crime reduction tool, where we tend to see significant increases in racial disparities, and we don't always see a great return on investment. And I think, over the last 10 years, we've been able to build a robust data set so that we can go in and convince police and say, here's the data, here are the facts, and at the end of the day, we want to help them achieve what they're oftentimes trying to achieve, which is safer streets, safer communities, but we want it to be done in a fair and equitable way. And we've largely been able to dispel, I think, some myths that have sort of occurred over the decades about certain types of violations across different racial groups, and we can get into that in a bit. But that's a general overview of what we do, how we do it, and why we think it is so important. And just the last piece is our program in Connecticut has become a model for the country. Rhode Island, California, Oregon have all modeled their programs after ours in Connecticut, and there's a handful of other states in the wake of the murder of George Floyd that have reached out and are passing legislation similar to what we have here in Connecticut. And so passing legislation to do more than just collect data, to analyze it in a thoughtful way, and to work with police departments to make use of that data to ensure that traffic enforcement is done in a fair and equitable manner.
Yeah, thanks for that thorough summary, Ken. It's really a fascinating area, like you just said. Taking that data and trying to make something of it is that next step that it seems like Connecticut is really trying to address. So next, hi, Mike. Thank you for coming today. Thank you for agreeing to be part of this conversation. I really do appreciate you doing that. It's not a conversation that every member of the police is ultimately willing to sit down and have with us. So I really do appreciate you being here and engaging with us today. So if you would like, just tell us a little bit about yourself, the work you're doing with New Haven Police, and kind of what brings you to this conversation today.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yep.
An echo or no?
I hear an echo.
Maybe if George, if you try muting yourself, the echo, let's try it again.
How is that? Still an echo? Hold on one second. Let me turn it on. How about now? Echo gone. Great. Sorry about that. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Mike Fumadi. I'm a lieutenant with the New Haven Police Department. I am a district manager in Fairhaven. I also run our hostage and crisis negotiation team in New Haven, and I run our crisis intervention team. A couple of things. I spent my entire career in Fairhaven. Fairhaven is a neighborhood that is very complex. We have a lot of different groups here, a lot of different issues, pretty much any issue you can imagine in an urban environment, this particular district has. That being said, it requires a different type of policing. It requires a different style of policing that is more receptive to people's trauma and where they come from, and how we really train our officers in New Haven overall, but then also in Fairhaven specifically, on trying to interact with people based on where they're at. And so we have a lot of issues. We have a lot of societal issues, and I think the conversation that we're having here is interesting because we've done a real disservice to communities by telling them that the police will help you for everything. And so what's interesting is we have people calling the police for issues that are not police issues, but we've done that for the last 30 years since the invention of 911. We've kind of made this environment where, hey, my neighbor parked blocking my driveway and I can't have a conversation with him, so let me call the police to deal with that. Or, you know, there's an animal in my my backyard and I don't know how to get it out of here. Let me call the police. I think this person might be, you know, looking into cars to break into cars. Let me call the police. And so this person might be having a mental health episode. Let's call the police. And so I think we are doing a good job as a society of transitioning out of that. And so I think with the bringing on of 988 and changing some of the responsibilities and allowing police to focus on violent crime and building partnerships with the community in an effort to see what the best way is to address that crime, rather than just being an occupying military force coming and going as they please. I think that we've done a very good job of that, and I think we still have a lot of work left to do. One of the things that was always interesting to me as I've been to many homicide scenes and many death scenes, and what's fascinating to me is that after a homicide, you'll see tons and tons of police. You know, I've walked around the city at different locations where homicides have occurred and where gun violence occurs. And what's interesting and really sad, actually, is that we haven't done. The police are almost like a Band-Aid after the fact. And so we'll put 20 officers, 30 officers, plainclothes officers, federal agencies, and we flood all of our resources in to those areas. But the day after, or the week after, or the month after, those resources kind of shift around to chase the violence, but all the while leaving everyone with no real resources for how to manage the trauma that they're witnessing every single day and the things that they're going through every day. And then we expect, we overwork police, and we have an over-traumatized community, and then we expect the two to meet on an even playing field. And it doesn't really make sense. And so I think what we've done in New Haven, at least, is try to build those partnerships, to try to educate officers on what it might be like, specifically dealing with any sort of crisis. That's what our officers are dealing with all the time, and trying to look at what other factors might be at play. What I mean by that is, for me, I love being a cop. I've been my grandfather was a cop in New Haven for 30 years. My uncle was a police officer in New Haven. But when I see a uniform, it has a different feeling for me than a lot of people in our community. And so, but if you don't have that conversation with cops, they think that when they're walking into a place, everybody loves them. Everybody wants them around. Everybody wants to engage with them. And so they might take it personally when people don't have that same feeling. And so there's a lot of education, I think, that's been done in law enforcement, and that still needs to be done on what really we represent and what really we're trying to achieve when we show up at a scene, at a call, and to look at more what are the underlying societal issues going on, and how best can we plug in people that don't carry guns and don't wear bulletproof vests. How can they come in and help when outside of the traumatic situations? Mr. Barone, I could listen to you talk all day. That the information that you provided is something that I think in policing, we don't do a good job of data collection. You know, if you don't like the New Haven police, you can't, it's like shopping at Walmart or Target. If you don't like Walmart and you never want to go to Walmart again, well, we're the only ones available to you. You can't shop around and get a different police department. You can't shop around and go to Target. You get what you get. And so I think in New Haven, we've done a really good job of that. Another organization that I'm a part of is CABLE, the Connecticut Alliance to Benefit Law Enforcement, which does crisis intervention team training statewide in Connecticut. And so we do 10 trainings a year. We rotate around the state, and 30 to 50 officers at a time from all jurisdictions. We have some really good conversations on understanding people living with homelessness, understanding a whole bunch of mental health and mental illnesses. And so that police officers, when they're interacting with people, they are much more understanding or empathetic of the situation that they're going into, rather than rushing right in and making some pretty serious decisions in situations that might not necessarily have had to bend that way. One of the things that we also, one of the things that we also don't do a very good job of in law enforcement, but we're getting better at, is looking at academia and studying data like Mr. Barone was talking about. And so there are these, age-old ideas about how we're supposed to do police work. And you can look at New York City as a perfect example of how it swings back and forth, where they had zero tolerance policing, and then they went back to kind of the opposite side of things. And then it swings back and forth with no real data collection. It's just kind of how we perceive things, but it's not, the numbers don't actually back that up. And so I think by having that data can really help us. One of the things I thought really stuck out to me as a supervisor, as I've been climbing the ranks in New Haven, was the San Diego Police Department a few years back had a per capita, they had an insane number of officer-involved shootings. And so what they looked at in control in these situations. One of the things was they found that most of the incidents were occurring within 15 minutes of the officers being dispatched. So what they did is they mandated that all of their supervisors, any supervisor who was working in these particular calls where there could be an officer involved shooting or increased likelihood of force, they mandated that the supervisors go. They saw an 80% reduction in officer-involved shootings after they instituted that policy. And so that's a simple thing where the amount of lives impacted by that is incredible. But all they needed was a little data set to look at, hey, let's try something and see what happens. And so I think that the way we're going is much better. It's much more scientific than kind of the ways of the past. When I got hired here, I was being trained by officers who had been trained by people who were in Vietnam. And so there's a big difference as the generation is slowly, it's changing and the population is changing. And so our officers are much more likely to be open to education and data as a way of, hey, why are we doing what we're doing? Is it effective? And so thank you very much for inviting me to the conversation.
And thank you again for agreeing to come, and I appreciate your comments now. And I'll take a moment because I see that we have Representative Phipps has come into the panel. So welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'll just give you a quick recap of who we have in the room so you know who you're speaking with. We already heard from Rashad Glass from the Public Defender's Office, and we heard from Ken Barone from the Connecticut Racial Profiling Prohibition Project. And I think you heard most of what Mike Fumadi had to say from the New Haven Police. So again, Representative Phipps, welcome. And if you would like, take a minute to introduce yourself, let us know a little bit about you, and what brought you to this conversation today. What made you want to talk about policing in our communities?
So, George, thank you once again for that wonderful introduction. And it was an honor to be with CHRO and on this panel in particular with a lot of expertise. Also, once again, I'm State Representative Q Phipps from the great city of Middletown, 100 District, representing half of Middletown. If you've ever eaten in Middletown, you've probably eaten in my district. That's what I like to say. This is my third term. I'm a co-chair of the Aging Committee. I also serve on Finance and Commerce. But I said, before I was a legislator, I was a community advocate and parent advocate. And I think that's really the lens in which I do my work as a legislator. I in no way believe to have all the answers for our systemic and community challenges and issues. I think that those that are closest to the problem are also closest to the solution. And being from Middletown, one of Connecticut's most diverse big towns, small cities in the entire state, and diverse in multiple ways. I think economically diverse, racially diverse, ethnically diverse. It would be hard to find folks from Middletown that do not, in particularly, take a strong affinity to the ethnicity, whether it's Sicilian or Polish, or in my case, African American, but I'm also Jamaican and West Indian. Though we hold that like near and dear to our hearts, and it's something that I think is unique about Middletown in terms of like the New England and tri-state sort of Connecticut feeling that we all have. With that appreciation for diversity and the interaction of diversity lends to many perspectives where folks can be part of the same situation and experience it in vastly different ways. So I shared that to say, so I grew up in a Sicilian and Polish neighborhood in the south side of Middletown. And my two best friends were both Polish. And one of my best friends in particular is now an officer in North Branford. And usually I don't call him my best friend, I call him my brother. His kids are my nephews. His wife is my sister-in-law. That is my brother near and dear. His grandfather is my Jaju. His grandmother was my Bacha. That's sort of closeness that we have. And seeing his transformation and growth as an officer of the law, while also I was going through my racial awakening as a parent advocate and also as a legislator, I've seen us go back and debrief interactions that we've had with policing, and now realize that we had vastly different understandings of what was happening, what was going on. And to see my brother feel those situations differently when almost all of his best friends were people of color too, it made me realize how deep the potential biases and misunderstandings and perspectives can be, which is why when we talk about community policing, we really have to define it. We have to really say like what does that look like? What does that feel like? And what are we trying to, dare I say, solve when we execute those sort of policies? And that's really what I want to talk about, because I think there is a way where we can all heal, we can all grow, we can all feel safe in our community, but we have to recognize the differences in which we allow that to happen. So for instance, if we said we wanted a strong and safe community or community policing in Greenwich, it wouldn't look like SROs in the schools. It wouldn't look like a policeman going back up and down patrolling on Main Street. That is not what it would look like. But if we said we wanted to have a more safer community in a relatively urban area like Middletown or some of our metropolitan areas, that would be the first suggestion: more policing, harsher punishments, punitive results. So what I would like to do is figure out how do we get the same social and political capital and financial capital that allows for community policing to look like in Greenwich and Darien and Glastonbury and so on and so forth, to look like that for the entire state.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And when you say, just to follow up briefly on what you said, because I think it's such an important part of this panel. When you say the term community policing, and maybe I'll open this up to, the four members of the panel in general to define what they think of, but you use the word first. What do you mean when you say community policing, Representative Phipps?
So several things. One, I think community policing looks like a true investment from our offices and public safety officials that would live in the city, that would interact in the city. What that means, their children are going to schools in the towns in which they are serving. They're going to church, they're shopping in the towns and cities that they live in. They are part of the community. Community policing has to go further than when they're on patrol. They walk into a store and wave hi, or they sit at one of the restaurants. I think it goes deeper into true participation. I think community policing also, beyond the actual just sort of like punitive ideas of it, I think it really goes to what do communities need in order to be safe? And I think very similar to what happened in our school systems, where we've asked teachers to be social workers, food providers, psychologists, therapists, so on and so forth. We've done the same thing for policing, where police are the first responders for mental health crises, for issues that come with homelessness, so on and so forth. What I would like to do is transform our police departments so that they have the resources that they need, and can call on community partners to be able to solve the issues that they are often called to do. Whether that's with an immediate public, like if there's immediate public safety, yeah, they're probably the best people to call. But if it's someone having a mental health crisis, if it's someone that people just don't feel comfortable with because, I don't know, homelessness makes you feel icky, they should not be the first calls, right? How do we expand their power to empower others, like our therapists, like our social workers, so on and so forth, like our teachers even, I would say, to be able to make sure that the community's needs are met.
Just to add to Representative Phipps, he made a point about, I think, the mental health in his comments. Almost half of all of the individuals killed by police in Connecticut since 2001 were in clear mental were having a clear mental health crisis at the time of that incident. So there have been 91 deadly use of force incidents in the state of Connecticut since 2001, and almost half of them there was the police reported at the time that the individual was clearly in mental health distress. They were emotionally disturbed, suicidal, etc. So, that's something that has always stood out to me as a data point that says, I don't know if this is the right way or the wrong way to look at it, but I always say, police are trained the way they're trained, right? And we give them certain tools to deal with certain situations. And then when we call them and they show up, we're surprised sometimes when they use those tools. Well, I think it gets back to the lieutenant's point and Representative Phipps' point, which is, as a society, we need to have a broader conversation about the role of police in responding to certain situations. Right? And are there other mechanisms that can be used or can be used in conjunction with law enforcement that are more equipped to deal with these situations? We saw, for example, when the taser was introduced a number of years ago onto the duty belt, right? The idea was that, I think initially we saw it was the idea that we would see fewer deadly use of force incidents as a result of this, right? That the taser would somehow replace the gun. Well, it's more complex than that, number one. And what we largely saw was that the taser was replacing other types of force, right? Hands-on combat or a baton or a chemical munition like pepper spray, but it was not necessarily driving down force in general. And so now it's fairly routine, right, for law enforcement to, try and gain control of a scene using a taser. And then sometimes we're surprised when they use the taser. And I always look back and go, well, we gave them the tool as a society. We said, we think this is something that you need to have. We spend lots of money and time training police so that they know how to use the tool. And then they show up to a scene and they use the tool, and we sometimes go, oh my gosh, how could they use the tool, right? Well, we gave it to them. And the thing I think we always have to be grounded in is sometimes the conversation falls at the feet of law enforcement. And I think at some point we have to just take a step back and say, well, we have to remember that law enforcement receive, fundamentally, they receive their policing power from us, from society, from the General Assembly who represents the people, right? That's where their police power comes from. So I think that, we need to be having more challenging discussions about what authority does society want law enforcement to have? What incidents do we want them responding to? And then we need to properly fund the other programs to prevent the need for police interaction in certain cases, or to be able to fund other response mechanisms that are just as effective, or that might be more effective, rather. And I'll just use a quick example. We've been having this discussion at the Racial Profiling Advisory Board level about traffic enforcement. There's hundreds of traffic laws on the books that the legislature put on the books. And, when we look at some of the violations that are disproportionately used on Black and brown drivers, that aren't necessarily applied in predominantly white neighborhoods, oftentimes the response that I hear from some law enforcement administrators in the state is, well, those are legal violations, and so I'm not going to go back to my officer and tell them that they can't stop a car because the license plate maybe has a frame around it that blocks part of the word Connecticut, which is a technical violation of the law, right? And I think at some point the legislature does need to step in and look at, for example, laws like that and say, okay, the intent might have been pure, right? I'll again use the license plate law as an example. The intent of passing an obstruction of plate law was that we as a society don't want people driving around with a piece of paper over their license plate, right? It is a way to identify the vehicle, and there's a whole host of important reasons for that. And it largely came out of, people putting those tint screens over the plates, which make them fairly illegible. But the law was written in such a way that, most people drive around either advertising the college they went to, or maybe where they bought the car. All right, the plate is still clearly legible. The frame might block off part of the word Connecticut, but because of the way the law is technically written, any obstruction of a license plate is a reason to stop you. And so, when you really understand the motor vehicle laws, what you need to understand is that it is virtually impossible for any motorist to get behind the wheel of the car and within 30 seconds of driving not have a technical violation of the law. And I think we have unfortunately seen historically that the idea was that discretion would be used by police, right? And that they would generally know, listen, we didn't really mean for you to stop a car for X reason. It was meant for Y. But I think, we've seen some of these laws be used in a way that is clearly disparate. And I think, we're looking to the police to solve that. And for me, as somebody who helps to devise policy, I look to the legislature and say, you do have a role to play here too. You gave the tool, you have a role in being able to curb a use of those tools. So I went in a couple different directions, but I hope that helps.
Thank you, Ken. I'll turn to you, Rashad, for a second. I mean, you've been in court pretty much every day for the past 15 years or so. So you're seeing this on a daily basis, the way the police interaction with the community is, what it's ending up with. People are ending up in court with criminal charges against them. Some extraordinarily serious, some de minimis. Can you talk about your experiences in court, what you're seeing on a day-to-day basis, and how you think that the role police are playing in that, be it positive or negative?
Certainly. Well, for the first, I'd say 13 years or so, I was in what's called we refer to as the GA, or geographical area court, which handles lower level felonies and misdemeanors. Over the past, basically since the beginning of the pandemic, I've been in the judicial district, which handles the more serious felonies. So I would say in the GA is where I would encounter more of those, traffic stops, low level violations, and general interaction with the police, whereas the cases that I'm seeing now require a lot more investigation, and it could be months since the alleged incident occurred before my client even has any interaction with any law enforcement. So I have seen some evolution, such as with the marijuana decriminalization, and that points to a lot to what Ken was saying, the importance of the legislature and people drafting policies and laws, and how crucial that is to law enforcement, all the way, just from the police departments to state's attorneys, and even what judges are permitted to do. And again, how do the people get to draft these laws? Well, they're elected. So that's also the part of the community's responsibility, is to know who you're putting in those seats to help draft those laws that eventually determine how you're going to be policed. So it is a lot of different issues there. And again, the marijuana decriminalization was one issue, and also, again, one issue that I think has, and I'm not pointing a finger saying all police are bad or anything, but one area that was lacking for pretty much my entire career that we're now starting to see some address to, is as far as not talking about implicit bias or anything like that, but what happens when things go completely wrong and something's going wrong? Where's the accountability? Well, I think the new inspector general positions that have been created, again, by our legislators, are a step in the right direction as well. So there's a lot of different areas that have to come together to improve this system.
Absolutely. I think accountability is a really interesting point that you bring up, Rashad, and I'll go down to you, Mike. What role do you think police accountability has in making an overall better police force, and what do you think that accountability should look like?
So thanks for the question, Mr. Welch. I think it's previously, in years past, it was kind of like we just trusted that the police were doing the right thing, and we were just going to leave them be and let them do what they do. I think with an interesting shift in my career was when people started having cell phone cameras, and so that really changed the game. And I don't mean to say game as if we're playing a game out here, but it changed the landscape of the way we're doing things when we're doing them. And so when the community, just like Mr. Barone said, when the community are the ones who allow us to do what we do. And so what's interesting is, if the community doesn't want us standing in front of cars and shooting into them, then why are we doing it? And so, like, we should have transitioned out. That's just bad police tactics. That's bad. That's a bad strategy in and of itself. And so what happens, I think one of the flaws, accountability looks, it should be like we're doing it. It's difficult because there's so many different things in play. And so what I mean by that is New Haven is very different than Avon. And the areas are different. The needs of the community are different, and yet I think the things that the community needs they need to have more of a say. And so and that's why drafting legislation like this, having input from the actual community that lives there and what they want, is incredibly important, because someone in Avon might be the loudest person, and we might have policy that's driven that way. And yet someone in New Haven goes, wait a minute, like, I'm the one who is going to receive this policy. Like, my family, my friends are going to be on the receiving end of this. And so as much as we don't want to admit it, or we may not want to admit it, the police department is the most outward facing, publicly available representation of the government. And so rather than reject that and push back against that, we should embrace it and become, I look at it as we end up providing a lot of resources to people and helping people navigate very complex situations that can be very challenging to navigate. One of the things I think everybody thinks of when they think accountability is the body camera. And I think that it is a tool that has helped us as a society, and also as police officers, maintain that accountability. I I think what's more so important than the body camera, and Mr. Barone probably could comment much more eloquently as to like the effectiveness and data associated with when departments have a body camera, then they see reductions in this. When they don't have a body camera, they see increases in this. I think what's interesting and what's more important than that is having key community stakeholders and people that the departments actually work with and know. So like something as simple as the community doesn't really want to see people getting punched in the head anymore, especially people of color. So why are we doing it? And so it's interesting, like you said, we have the tools, and then we're mad. We give police the tools, and then we're mad that they don't use the tools appropriately, or they use the tools. And so I think we're circling back on the accountability thing and the importance of it. I think what we do is we kind of check the box with police training. And so what happens is as long as you got taught this class, you're all set. And so you do a couple of hours of, defensive tactics, control, and then we expect you to be, an expert martial artist when you're stressed out and someone challenges you physically. The demands of being in a physical confrontation, that's something that should be trained all the time. And so I think what we can do is we can train people, and we can, by putting more effort into looking at officer doesn't matter if it's justified or not justified legally, but what are we looking at? And is this acceptable from not only a police standpoint, but also from a community standpoint? If anyone watches a video and goes, "Oh, geez, that's too much," that's something that we should look at. And so I think I've seen a lot of stuff, and I haven't done a lot of research on it, but I've seen a decent amount of things that are showing. There's a couple of research studies that show that officers who are trained in jujitsu or different martial arts, and I'm not saying that jujitsu itself, but having more of a working knowledge in those things changes the fear of the encounter. And so cops oftentimes say, "I was an
interesting thing,
so I did that. I was afraid of this, so I did that." What I've seen is that by kind of training officers in mental illness, when you see someone who's in the midst of an episode related to schizophrenia and they're completely in a psychosis, that can be very frightening. And so if you're afraid, you're going to act a certain way. And so I think what we have to do is look at kind of how do we have a group of people that are empathetic for the situations that they're going to, that are healthy individuals, mind, body, soul, and they have the adequate tools that they need to perform what society wants them to do. And what's interesting about someone said earlier about the taser. Honestly, we were tasing everybody as soon as we got those, because everyone was like, "Whoa, we don't have to punch anybody anymore. Like, let's use a taser." And sometimes there's other techniques that we can use other than relying on those weapons. And so what we saw is when officers were more reliant on the taser, they put less effort into the training that they should have been doing in more control techniques, in more jujitsu style or non-impact martial arts, because, well, what do I have to do that for? I can just use a taser. And so I think accountability is a whole. The community conversation is first. What is acceptable, what's not? And there's always going to be people on either side that are saying to the extremes, but in the middle, what are we saying we want from the police? I think in the last few years of my career, really post-Ferguson, we've started to see that coming out, where the community is saying, this is what we want, this is what we don't want. And departments, rather the good departments, are saying, okay, like, come to the table, let's talk about it. And I think that's where accountability starts.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. I appreciate your thoughts on that. Really interesting stuff, especially with thinking about the alternatives to force, things that don't necessarily come to my mind. I'll turn it over to Representative Phipps. I see you've got your hand activated. What would you like to comment
So
on?
Lieutenant, I appreciate those words because I do think one of the leading expertises that we will lean on in order to change how we do public safety in our state and our country is if officers first speak up and say that they recognize that a lot of these systems are at bare minimum ineffective, but I would say oftentimes create more harm. So I've studied martial arts my entire life. I'm terrible at it, which is absolutely terrible at it, which is why I don't fight. But things like the first thing that you learn as a martial artist is if you are engaged in any sort of like physical altercation, the expectation is to get hurt. Either you will hurt somebody or you will get hurt, and the expectation should be that you are going to get hurt. So using things like jujitsu is not a way to decrease risk. It's actually a way to increase risk. The number one thing that jujitsu was designed for was for you to create space and then leave. And I think those sort of misunderstandings are why we have to change these sort of systems. So things that I would like our president officers and leadership to speak up about are things like civilian review boards, and how they are an important part to create accountability and saying, you know what, yes, we have internal affairs, and yes, we have these sort of mechanisms to investigate, but here is another way of accountability, not just to prove that someone has done something wrong, but here's a way to prove something that we have done something right. Another two examples that are pretty prominent in terms of this public safety conversation right now. And I said, I really do wish that officers would just speak up and talk more about the truth. So for instance, things like a high-speed chase. We're not doing high-speed chases because we want someone that is possibly doing a crime to get away. We're doing that is because it keeps the entire community safer. So it keeps the officer safe, it keeps bystanders safer. And if you do good community policing afterwards, it's a lot easier to go find that person in their home or at a loved one's home, and then take them into custody that way. It is safer, it is cheaper, and it is better for the community. Another great example, right now we're having a lot of conversations about the stealing of cars. Yes, I can see that the data does say that we've had less car thefts in the entire state of Connecticut. If you look at it on a purely data issue, I will also say that, yes, it is a problem. Why is it a problem? It's mainly a problem in the urban areas where we've had problems with car thefts for decades. And as I said, I will ask folks I'll ask a rhetorical question, is what is different now than before? Why it's suddenly a problem now, but it wasn't before? I want officers to speak up and say the number one way to help out with this issue is to lock your cars. It's to lock your cars. And it's interesting right now, in particular in the conversation around policing, particularly with the adoption of vaccines, is that we have been told over and over again to follow, if people just follow the law or follow what was being told, we wouldn't have these sort of issues. And things like risk reduction, which is something that urban communities have often had to do. We're now being heard to told that that's blaming the victim. And instead of it being harm reduction, was something that we all have to do normally. So my point is this, is that if we can recognize that we have been trained to do the work in such a way that is either not going to lead to the outcomes that we want, it is okay to say that things could be better, should be better, and here's the actual way to fix it. And I said, as an elected official, as a policymaker, we amend laws all the time. From the very beginning in the Bill of Rights, they started off with 10 amendments to say that we messed up 10 times, we forgot 10 things. And I think if we start to take that sort of approach, that there was views of doing things that one way, and now it is time to do it a different way in order to protect us all, both our public safety and also our morality. That is the way to move forward for all of our sakes, including those that are serving, like my brother.
Absolutely, really well said. Thank you for that. Ken, I'll ask you a question that comes from a colleague of mine, Anna Marie Purrier. It's in the chat, and it kind of builds off of something that you had said earlier. The question was, you talked about a municipality that was receptive to discussing how to best accomplish, a goal of ending or eliminating racial profiling. But what about municipalities or jurisdictions that don't want to work towards fixing that problem of racial profiling, or that they show a degree of hostility towards it, that they question the science you're doing, drag their feet. What are those interactions like, and how do you work with those type of municipalities?
We've been, like I said, we've been at this for about a decade now. We've published 6 statewide reports in the state of Connecticut since 2015. And in those 6 reports, we've identified 30 of our 94 municipal police departments that had what we term statistically significant disparities. And over the last 6 years, we've gone in to those departments to try and have tough conversations and to drill down on the data and say, okay, we're seeing a disparity and you're claiming, like I used the example about the defective lighting, let's see if that's true. Let's see, what kind of data we can put around that, and let's see what we can do to intervene. Most of the time, early on, the project has evolved. Early on, there was skepticism across the board. We'd go into a police department. We had challenging conversations. They bordered on hostile at times, right? But at the end of the day, the data really ruled the day. And when you could sit there and say, I get it, but look at X, right? X is a hard fact. I'll give you another example. We had one town that was stopping a really significant number of Hispanic motorists for driving unregistered vehicles. And, they said, well, what do you want us to do about it? It's a socioeconomic problem. You guys want to come in here and you want to tell us it's all race related. This has to do with money, right? And we said, well, okay, I guess it's possible, right, that you have to pay a registration fee and that costs money. And if you have a socioeconomic issue, it might be hard to pay that bill. And therefore, you might see, in poor communities, higher rates of unregistered vehicles. That's a theory. The question is, does the data bear out that hypothesis as fact? Or the other alternative is that your officers just run plates where they think poor people drive and they find lots of unregistered vehicles, and then they create a self-fulfilling prophecy that says, see, look, we told you all the poor people, which happen to be, because of where we're running them, largely Hispanic or largely Black, have unregistered vehicles. And, then a culture gets created within an agency that they start to run plates more frequently in some neighborhoods as opposed to others. And so we ran an experiment. We said, fine, let's test your theory. Because if your theory is right, fine, then we'll back off. You can go back to your community and say, hey, listen, this is what it is. What we ended up finding was that white drivers in predominantly white neighborhoods were 7% more likely to be driving around an unregistered vehicle than Black or Hispanic motorists in the higher Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. But a culture had been created that when you run license plates, right, or you use your license plate reader technology, you do it where, right, the idea was this isn't race related, it's socioeconomically driven. And so, that's an example of, having a tough conversation and then using the data to say, okay, let's pull that thread. Let's pull it all the way to the end and see where it leads us. I'm happy to report that of the 30 agencies we've worked with, I can honestly say that 29 of them have been ultimately come to the table in an honest way. Maybe not initially, but the data sort of helped to open their eyes, and they were open and receptive to reforms and to interventions. Because at the end of the day, what we were showing them was, look, we can make it better for you. We can decrease your disparities and increase public trust, public safety, right? My approach has always been, I'm not the police chief. Chief, you tell me what you're trying to achieve. If it's, hey, I have, these 3 crimes that are spiking and I need to deal with that. Okay, let's help you use the data to develop a strategy that will help you achieve the goal you established, while also reducing and eliminating racial disparities, whether intended or unintended. And, in the case of the one agency that really ultimately wasn't all that cooperative, unfortunately, the best that we could do in that case was to just keep pointing it out, right? To keep holding up the data and saying, you tell me this isn't a problem, right? And I'm happy to report that it's taken 6 years. And unfortunately, that community and the communities that surround it have had to deal with a type of policing that was clearly disparate. But eventually, right, I'd like to believe the data won the day, and the leadership change took place just a few months ago, and the department, I think, is still going to have some growing pains in the coming months. But that's the exception, that's the outlier. And I think because of the stakeholders at the table on the advisory board, because the advisory board has good law enforcement representatives along with different advocacy groups and state agencies, it has provided a level of credibility that we no longer face the resistance when walking into a police agency today to have these conversations that we did in 2015 and 2016. They're no longer contentious. And part of that is also just a shift in police leadership in general. Some of the police leaders that were really vocally against the reforms to the racial profile law in 2011 and 2012 are no longer in the business. And leaders that are entering that space now, as I'm sure, the lieutenant has sort of advanced in his career, you're seeing those leaders now advancing in their career, understanding the importance of these things, understanding the importance of embracing data, embracing these conversations in a way that culturally some of the leaders that had been around for a long time just weren't, I think, in a position to be able to really accept.
Thanks, Ken. I'll turn back to you for a moment, Mike, because I'm thinking about something. I'm just thinking about the way this conversation's going, and I've really enjoyed it in just kind of overhearing it all. And I think fundamentally there's an issue, and we've talked about it in a few different ways, whether it's I think what Ken was saying, how we've given police officers tools and then we feel like these tools aren't being used correctly, or more along what Representative Phipps was saying when we talked about the kind of what we expect from police officers, and we're not seeing that. And I think what it comes down to, and to put it bluntly, is that it seems like right now there's a broken covenant. I think the people who are marching in the streets, after George Floyd, or after some issues like Anthony Vega Cruz that happened in Connecticut, they feel betrayed. They feel like that sacred promise had been broken. And when it's something that's so fundamental as that, I mean, we're talking about a lot of practical solutions about how to handle people with mental health, and how to handle, force escalations, and how to handle, statistics and data. But ultimately, there needs to be a rebuilding of that covenant. There has to be something fundamental, something that builds from like a base place. Beyond, policing better, to use just a rough term. How do you think the police can begin to rebuild that covenant with the people of Connecticut? Because I don't think it's simple as it's just policing better. I mean, there's going to have to be some sort of bridge building. What do you think that looks like?
That is an incredibly difficult question. Sure. But I would say that I think it has to start with partnerships and allowing the openness of each department. And so whatever those 30 departments were that were mentioned, it should be something right off the beginning where it shouldn't take 6 years to get in the door. Think about all the stops and all the issues that were happening throughout that 6 years. There has to be a mechanism in place so that if the issue is happening today, how can it change today? How can something be, you might need data collection time, you might need something else, but I mean, I think government and municipal government moves very slowly. And so, unfortunately, I think one of the things that we can do is try to figure out how to speed that timeline up, one. And then, honestly, it's interaction. Every interaction that officers have with people should be seen as a way to try to build those partnerships. Every single person that officers are interacting with has the potential to kind of build that back up. And so I really don't like the term. It's not I hate the term de-escalate. I mean, I hate the term de-escalation because it's good communication. And so de-escalation, our officers it also puts the emphasis on the officer to de-escalate a situation. And so, but they might be looking at de-escalating a person. And so I understand we use that terminology, but it's got to be better communication and it's got to be better control. And so when we have officers who show up to a scene that have better control of themselves, that have better control of their fear, have better control of their understanding of people, they then are more likely and better suited to interact in a situation, and they're going to perform better in those situations. One of the things about modern law enforcement that we haven't done, when I was in high school and played football, we watched game tape. And so it's interesting that like no one had done that before. We haven't done that. And so now we have this whole wide variety of, hey, how can we get better here? How can we do better here? And that's, I think, partly what Mr. Phipps was saying about the Civilian Review Board is having those conversations with people who have a different view, where he can sit down with his brother who's on Brantford PD and talk about that realistically and somehow meet in the middle, I think is how you get better. Another thing that's interesting is I don't really like the term community policing either. I think it's just good policing. It's being like, so that if you use the term community policing, it's interesting because then it's saying that there's something else other than community policing. And so in my mind, good policing, good police work is knowing people in your community, having a relationship with them, understanding their needs. But that comes with a whole host of things that have to be done. And you can't just hire somebody and day one they step out of the academy and all of a sudden like they're a miracle worker that can do all of these things and communicate effectively. I really think it has to start with training. I really do. I think there's two pieces. How do you change what you have already? And so I think the police accountability bill and some of the conversations that we're having around that are a way to change what we have already because we have to change what we have now. And then the slow moving government has to take what you're trying to hire and the police officers that you're trying to put out. And they have, by the time they get to the street, they have to have a generational difference than the group before them. And so they have to have that understanding. They have to have that training. And I would say that policing to do a better job of including people in the solutions. And so including mental health professionals, including academics, including people from the community. I think that's a very good way to start that. I think from both prongs, the active cops that you have now, how do you hold them accountable and change their minds maybe about data or how they do what they do? Because they might be doing things that they think are the right thing to do, but through data and through information we know are not effective. So I think that's one, and then the others is really looking at how we train cops, what we want them trained in, what kind of people they are, and then how we transition that to the real world. I think it's a really complex thing. It's
taken us a long time to get broken. It's going to take a while to get fixed. But yeah, I mean, I think that I agree with you in the sense that interacting with different people, the more you interact with different people, it's amazing how discrimination and hate goes away. The more you're exposed to different groups and different people. So I mean, I think you speak the truth in saying making sure the community gets involved and in the training and the exposure is an important step. But I see we're getting a little bit low on time, and it's been a great flowing conversation. But I do want to make sure we have a chance to look at the questions that are in our chat. And I see one from Edith Pestana. And I think this question is probably directed towards you, Ken, but anyone can comment on it. If you have information that indicates a significant profiling or disparities, I know is a word that you prefer to use, why not refer that information to federal enforcement?
Just real quick, because we're low on time. As you can imagine, under the previous administration, civil rights investigations of law enforcement departments was non-existent. Under the administration prior to that, we actually, in fact, had, engaged the U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Connecticut in conversations. It had to get to a pretty high point. I think, the thing to remember is that data analysis is only ever one component of a civil rights investigation. So, we don't want to get into it, but I'm sure if Cheryl was here, Sharp, the deputy director, as she always reminds me, there's a number of components that go into being able to make a civil rights case. And what we do is really only a piece of that, right? And so I do know that our data has been used in cases previously here in the state of Connecticut, civil cases in particular. But the federal government is, they're very cautious about when they intervene in state or local policing issues. But we do try and engage them if and when appropriate.
Is there anybody from the audience who would like to ask, ask a live question? If you want to raise your hand on the little hand button on the top of your screen, now would be a good time to do that. Otherwise, I do know we had a couple other questions in the transcript. All right, so Rashad, I saw a question earlier from another colleague of mine, Robin Trevinier, and she had asked if you could touch on the effects of an arrest for a petty crime or misdemeanor of a person of color individuals versus white people, both regarding the after effects, like a record, as well as the differences during the course of the criminal proceeding.
Well, that's a question that probably takes a lengthier.
We could have a whole other panel, yeah.
Yeah. Limited time. I could just say that the studies have shown that as far as after effects of petty crime or felony, that for a white individual, especially a white male, going forward trying to get a job, it is easier with a record and without a degree than it would be for a black male with no record. So, I mean, the after effects for misdemeanor are significant. As far as going through the criminal proceeding, there are certain factors that affect it. One being whether that person is incarcerated or not while during the pendency of their case, and so obviously bail reform has worked towards trying to alleviate some of those disparities. But the short answer is yes, there are disparities, and the other answer is that there have been attempts to address those, and we still have a long way to go.
Absolutely. All right, so we have about 1 minute left on the clock. This is last call, everybody. Any questions, comments, concerns that the audience would like to bring up? This is your last shot. Otherwise, I will throw it over to our panelists for any parting comments any of you might like to make.
I'll just say that it was great to be here with everybody. Representative Phipps, Rashad, as always, it's great to have you on the advisory board. Lieutenant Fumadi, thank you for your leadership in policing. And a big thanks to CHRO, who, by the way, has been at the table every month for over 10 years, focusing on the racial profiling issue. So thank you for that.
Thank you all for coming and for participating. We really appreciate each and every one of you.
Absolutely. I do appreciate all of your time and willingness to have this conversation. This is always a relatively difficult conversation. So I certainly appreciate you guys coming here and engaging openly and honestly today. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
All
everyone.
right. All right,
you.
so everyone.